All right, welcome to class number 3. So we're going to cover basically is JavaScript. So this is going to be much more complicated than previous things that we have done because this is like more of a real programming language. All right, let's go. So JavaScript. Basically, JavaScript is an object-oriented language, which is pretty much what all modern scripting or programming languages are. Used to develop organized blocks of commands. It's often used to add dynamic components to the web. One of the things you do have to take into account is that JavaScript is not web specific. You'll see it used in other ways in other programs. It has a lot of different uses, but we do use it in the web just because it's pretty useful. But remember that it's a scripting language, not a programming language. It pretty much runs exactly the same, and what that basically means is that a programming language will create like it's a self-executable, like it just runs itself. Like if people who write Photoshop or Windows or whatever, right? Like those, like they're self-functioning. Just like HTML and CSS get interpreted by the browser, JavaScript is a list of commands. It's scripts that are being read and acted upon, okay? But unlike these two, HTML, CSS, where they're relatively simple, it just formats things. This will, create functions and do things like calculators and all sorts, time and, all the things that you would normally see in a programming language. But it's interpreted, in this case, by the browser, so. It's basically the same thing. If you programmed other languages, it's going to be very similar. And as we've been working, if you remember, HTML is basically the content, right? That's how you put in your text. It's how you attach images. It's how you make links. But it's the actual content. By itself, it doesn't look real great. It's just basically text and pictures. CSS applies to design, right? So that will change the scale of it. That will change the color of things. That will change background. Width and height and all sorts of different things, right? It's how you create your color schemes, all that. So that's basically your design elements are off of CSS. Well, your JavaScript will create the interactivity, which basically means it'll allow you to do things where you can click on something and something happens, or it moves, or adds even more dynamic kind of content, as opposed to just straight up. With these alone, they're almost exactly the same as a written, a written page, right? Something printed out that you could hold. JavaScript makes it where it's something that would have to be on a screen because it's movement and interactivity. Complexity. So HTML was a markup language. So if you remember, like I said before, basically you have elements and you just have opening and closing tags generally, and it wraps around them. CSS isn't that much different than that. You have selectors and then you apply rules. JavaScript is a scripting language, so it's significantly more complicated than these two, okay? And you'll see in a bit. And then like C, C#, Python, those are all programming languages, although Python's also used as scripting, but it's actually pretty similar to these two. So just be aware that this is like a whole level above what we've been doing. But, it's one of those things. But you can do really cool things with it. Okay. So introduction to programming, I always mention this when we do the HTML and the CSS and stuff like that. Just remember that it's just like any other language. It's going to have a syntax and it's going to have semantics, right? So it's going to have to be written a certain way in order for it to understand what you're writing. And there is certain built-in words, keywords, that do things. It has a vocabulary of things that you're just going to have to kind of basically memorize, like a list of things. A lot of them, honestly, I don't even know. Usually I look up how to do something, and I know how the syntax goes, so I'm able to jumble whatever, different words I can find together to make happen what I want to happen. All right, so let's talk about the JavaScript structure. This is going to be a really boring class, by the way. Okay, so JavaScript structure. So you have variables, statements, functions, and objects, okay? So the variables are basically just containers that hold objects. That's the most basic unit. So it's like, it could be a number, it could be text, it could be things like that, okay? True, Boolean, true or false. Or on or off or whatever. Statement, it's just a single line of code, right? So that's as simple as basically, it could be something where it's a condition, like if this is this, then this, or a mathematical statement typically. So, 1 plus 3 equals whatever. That's like one statement. It's one line of code. Then you have functions. Functions are basically just a bunch of blocks of statements. Okay. A statement is also a variable. So when you if you have a variable, you'll say like down here, like var dog names equal to Paco. That's a statement, but it's also a variable. Okay, so it's an assignment. So a function basically is just a block of statements. So you could look at it like if a statement was a single line of text, a function would be a paragraph. Okay, so it's one cohesive thing that does that happens all together. Okay. But it's a whole slew of these. And an object is basically properties, so variables. So I could have, like, let's say an object that's a dog, right? Well, there could be things about the dog. The dog could be brown. The dog could be a lab. The dog could be, friendly. Those are like basically the properties of the dog. We can have events, which basically means, you could pet the dog. You could call the dog's name, right? These are things that you can do to it to interact with it. And then they can have functions or methods. And basically that would be things that the dog could do, right? So the dog could eat food. The dog could poop on my bed. That literally happened last week. Really sucky. The dog could pee on my bed. Did that the week before. It could do all sorts of things, all sorts of defecation, but all sorts of different functions that a dog could do. Okay, so what you do is you will make these various things. You'll notice that each one kind of builds on the last one. Okay, and that's basically how the thing will work, right? So I kind of said this already. So variables. Let's start with variables. Let me get up a piece of. Let me see. What was I working on over here? This one's kind of crappy. I'm gonna give. Let's bring up Studio Code. New window. All right, and I am going to pause this and start writing some HTML so that we can kind of see it. All right. Okay. So yeah. So I wrote just this basic stuff here so you can kind of see it. So I'm just going to tab in, and what you're going to write is script like this, like so. Okay. So back in the day, there used to be a thing you have to write script, and you'd write type, and then you'd write, I think, JavaScript or something like that. Script. But you don't need to do that anymore because as of HTML5, it's just script. But if you see something else written in there, that's why it's there. Okay, so let's talk about variables. Okay, so variables, basically variables can store, update, or replace data. So basically all it is look at it like it's a container. It's just a box that can hold something, okay? Now, in order to declare a variable, you basically have to use the keyword var, right? That's the keyword, which means it's a reserved word. What that means is that you can't name anything var. You can't, var means variable as far as it's concerned. So it can be used for nothing else other than to declare a variable, okay? Then it has to have a name. And then if you want, you can also give it a value, okay? So if you look at here, we have a variable. That's the thing. Okay, this is going to be, we have var, which means it's going to be a variable. This is the name that I came up with. It could be whatever you want. It's the same thing as saying, like, 1 plus x equals 3. And then you have to find out what x is. It's the same idea, but you kind of work different. So this is just a placeholder. This is what you're naming your box so that you can use that box for other things, okay? And so in this case, I had a variable dog name, and I just set it equal to, or not equal to, I assigned the value of Paco to it. So basically var, or this dog name box, is going to hold the value Paco, but it could be a var, and I'll call it like, I don't know, math number, or math num, I might call it, and then I would just put like equals, or I'm sorry, assign it the value of 10, and then that box will hold 10, okay? So that's the basic idea with it. Now, the name, it cannot begin with a number. I mean, you can't like have the name be like 3 something something. It can't have a number. It's got to start with a letter. It can't include spaces. So you'll notice that with this, see how I wrote dog and then name, I put it all as one word. Now you can use underscore if you like want to put other things in there. So, but I would suggest this is called camel case. So basically you start with a lower case word, and then each subsequent word is a capital letter for each start of it, okay? So you can clearly see it says dog name even though there's no space in there. You can't use a reserved word. I already kind of mentioned that. Camel case is what we did. So if you look down here, you can actually kind of tell. So if you look at this one, it says you can actually read a whole sentence without spaces. Much harder if camel case is not used, or even worse in all caps, right? So this is a lot harder to read. But this, you don't even need spaces. We've been wasting our time on spaces. Just rip your space bar right off your keyboard. Now, when you apply a variable, a value to a variable, it's called an assignment. This is what you see here. And basically, these are the data types, okay? Or data types, or whatever your favorite Star Trek guy is. So you can have a number, meaning like 123, negative, 1 point. Okay, it can have string, which is just text like a word. Boolean, which is true or false. It can be an array, which is just a list of items. So basically, it's you could have like color choices, could be the name of the variable, and then inside of that, you could have white and black and red, and each one of those are an option. And there's other ones as well, like there's a document object model, which we'll talk about later on, but basically objects can have can kind of be variables in and of themselves, okay? We have scope, local, and global. What that means is that when you write a variable, so right now if I write a variable in here, I call it var, we'll just do the same thing, dog name, right? And I'll assign it the value of Paco. That's my dog's name. He's a good dog. He's a good dog. That will only exist inside of here. If I later on write another script, okay, and I do tab document dot write, and then I think it's like this. I don't always remember. H3 concatenating my dog name plus. Oops, I meant plus. There we go. And then boom, boom, H3. And I think that's right. And if we save that, Command R. Okay. Let me bring this over here. You can see that it writes Paco. So inside of here, okay. Now you can see it showing up here. And the reason being is that these all exist in the same area. But if I were to write, we'll do it like this. If I were to write oops, I don't want to do it like that for function, and we'll call it dog name. I don't know. Let's not call it dog naming. We'll call it dog naming. Okay. I write a function called dog naming. And then inside of that function, I put this guy, Command X, tab, Command V, Command S, Command R. You'll see it doesn't show up because it only exists inside. See how there's these blocks here? If it's inside these blocks, only things that are inside it, Command C, we'll be able to see it, Command V. Oop, So let's go away. I don't want you. Get out of here. Only things that are inside can see it, okay? And then I just need to call this dog naming. Okay, and now if I save it and refresh it, you can see there it is, okay? Because it has to exist in the same block that this is, otherwise it won't read it. So even though these are on a different script chunk, it won't be able to see these because this would be local to this. But when it was outside of this function, everything can see it. Okay, so just be aware that sometimes some of your variables might not be able to be read by certain other variables, and that's why. Another thing to take into account, I don't know if you noticed this, but I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this one because we don't need that one anymore. Is that notice that this is being read or written right here. So just like HTML, see how like I write H1, that was the first thing written, then it wrote this because that was the next thing written. The script will function wherever you place it. So if I put this above these, I'm just going to copy it for now, Command V, Command S, Command R, you'll see it'll happen before, okay? So generally speaking, it's considered best practice to put it at the end because a lot of times what you're doing is you're interacting with you might be interacting with these, and you can't interact with these unless they've already been read, they've been written. if this happens up here and it's supposed to talk to an H1, well, there's no H1. It hasn't happened yet. So you want to put it after everything in your HTML so that the HTML gets written and then your script runs. Because if your script runs and there's no HTML written, it can't interact with something that's not there. Okay? Okay, so statements. A statement is a single line of code that contains instructions. Okay, so it can be a variable assignment, such as what we just did. It could also be something like this. So I'm just going to copy this. Most of the time, you're going to see that it's going to be some sort of mathematical equation or some sort of condition. So we'll just let's see. We'll just do another one here. Let's tab these guys in. Tab, tab, tab. Yeah, that should be fine. So in this case, I made a variable. I made a variable named total. I made total. I gave it the value of 5 plus 5, and then it's going to write it, and subsequently we should get 10. Voila. Okay, so that's a statement. This is doing something. This is doing something. Each one of these, you'll notice they always end with a semicolon, generally speaking. That's a statement that you wrote. Okay. So yeah, that's that. You can also write comments, and you should do that constantly. So, I could do boom like this, and then go store my dog's name into the dog name variable. Okay, and all that does is it's something that the computer will not see, but you can see when you read the code, and it tells you what's going on. It's literally a comment so that people know. Now this will do one line. It's also really useful if you want to see if something's working. I can just do a // and now that's a comment. Or if I want to do a whole block of them, you do, did I do that? Nope. You do this, / asterisk, and then where you want it to end, you do asterisk /, and it will block out everything from here to here, okay? So both of those are super useful. One, you should be commenting anyway, so that you know what things are that you're making. But also it's good for troubleshooting and debugging. If you're trying to figure out what isn't working, you can block something out and be like, okay, well that part might be the part that's screwing it all up. All right, you can have operators. So they can be assignments, math, or concatenations that evaluates into a single value. Okay, so some common operators. So obviously a plus is addition, minus is subtraction, multiplication, division, and modulo. Modulo means that it'll give you the remainder of what ends up being, right? So if we do, I don't know, 6 divided by, or let's say 5 divided by 2, right? Well, that would be 2 plus 1, so you end up with 1, right? That's modulo. Additions also concatenate strings. So what that means is that if you look right here, I did document.write. I did this, a plus, then the variable, then this. Basically what I did is I combined this text string with this variable name, which is actually a piece of text string, and then I added it to this. And the reason why I did it like this is because document.write will just write out whatever, but it's not formatted anyway. This will actually make it an H3. So this way, in essence, it's writing HTML. It's writing an H3, the dog name, and then the closing. So it looks like H3, Paco, H3, and then that's what it'll write out. And that's why you'll notice here, this looks like this, and the one that was just the addition I wrote just document.write, it's just probably going to be a paragraph. So it's not formatted any kind of way. All right. And there's a bunch of other ones here. So if you do plus plus, that's the same as hitting +1. So a lot of times you'll see later on, like you'll have a counter, and you'll, instead of saying like I plus 1, you'll just do I plus plus. So if I happen to be number 10, so if you did I plus plus, it'll become 11. And then if you did I plus plus again, it'd be 12, so on and so forth, okay? And then this is a decrement, 2 minuses. You could do plus equals, which means, so if I do plus equals total, what I'll do is the same as adding, plus equals. If I do total plus equals 1, it'll be total plus 1. So that's, and minus equals, although I didn't put a minus there. Well done. I did these all the same. Well, anyway, it's the same as doing these over here. I gotta fix that. You can do a comparison. So if something greater than or equal to, you probably know what these. This is the only one that might be a little bit different. 2 of these means it's equal to. Sometimes you'll see equals. You'll see 3 of them. That means that it's both equal in value and equal as it's the same type. It means it's like super equal. Okay. And then if you do exclamation point equals, that means it's not equal to. Okay. There's also logical. So if you do two ands, that means it has to be this and that, or two ampersands, sorry. Two of these straight things are or, and in general, a little exclamation point is not. So like where this would just be equals, putting this and that makes it not equal. Okay, so just in general, you might occasionally see this thrown on something. All right, so we can have conditions and loops. Where do I gotta go? Okay, conditions and loops. So if we were to look at conditions and loops, basically you can have, these are the main ones, but you can have if statements, for loops, while loops, do while loops. So the idea here is that you would have a condition. You say if such and such condition, what's in between these parentheses is true, it's going to run what happens between this the opening and closing brackets. Okay. Else, if it's not true, it's going to go ahead and do this. So an example of what that would look like is if you look at here, I could say if, and then in parentheses I say the score. So I would have a variable that had score up here. Let's say score is we assign it to, so we do var score equals, and we'll say 60. Okay. So we'll say if the score is greater than or equal to 75, it's gonna do what's inside these brackets, and it's gonna document.write, and it's gonna write pass. Else, it's gonna do fail, and if you know, it would be fail because it's not greater than. Because if I send the value to 60, that would be less than, and that's basically how it works. So basically, you set up a branch of options. Now there's also for loops. So you'll say for, as long as what's happening in between these parentheses are true, it's going to run this block of code. As soon as it becomes not true, it's going to go past it. It's going to stop running that bit, and it's going to just go to the next thing. So in this case, we start with a variable called I, and we set it equal to 0. So the I you're almost always going to use. It's basically our counter. So we're going to start at 0, and we're going to say while I is less than 10, and then every time you run this block of code, it's going to be I++, which means add 1 to it. So what it's going to do is to say, okay, I is 0. 0 is less than 1, right? So I currently is 0, so that's less than 10. It's going to go ahead and do document.write, and it's going to write the number. So it's going to say 0. Then it's going to add 1 to it. Variable I, this is no longer true anymore. Variable I will be equal to 1. 1 is still less than 10. It'll write 1. And it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and it'll run this every time until it gets to 9. Because once it's 10, it's not equal. It's not less than 10. So it's going to go from 0 to 9, and then after that it'll run down. Okay, so that's a common thing you're going to see too. There's also while, which is kind of like a for loop. Basically, you set up a variable. So I'll say the variable the score is 0, and what it's going to do is it's going to say while what's in here is true, it's going to run this code. So while the score is not 100, started out at 0, I want you to take the score and add 1 to it because it's score ++ increment, and you're going to write the score. So this is basically going to go, it's going to print off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to you get to 100, until it's not 100, all the way up to 99, and then that's what will happen. So then over here we have kind of the same thing again, a do while loop. It's kind of like a while loop, but what that means is it will run the code first. So if I do variable score 75, and I say, okay, do what's in these brackets, so it's going to document, it's going to write the score. Then it's going to say, while the score is not 100, it's going to go up. So for instance, if I said, while the score is not 75, right? Let's say I changed that. It would still print out 75 first and then stop running. It's always going to run first because it's a do while. As opposed to a while, which is going to test it to see if it's true first and then run. This one's going to do it and then test afterwards. Okay? And that's do while loops. Okay? Pretty much, honestly, I usually just use these. I don't use the while or the do while because it causes errors often. Okay. Functions and methods. So functions and methods. Basically, a function is a block of code that you can call whenever you want to. So for instance, I have this function hello world, and in that function what it does is it just writes hello world, and then I can call that function. So for instance, over here I have dog naming, right? I could do dog naming, oops, naming again, right? Oops, if I knew how to write. Okay, now you're going to see when we go to do it, it's going to write dog. It's going to do those things twice. So I can call it as many times as I want. And you can even do this. So let's get rid of this. And we're going to put in, let's see. Find it. Okay. Let's go ahead and we will put dog naming. And I'm going to put, let's say, Paco. And I'm going to copy this. Command C. And we're going to paste this. Command V. And then we'll also, here we'll do Priscilla. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is we're going to up on the top here. We'll just put name. And we'll make variable dog name. Backspace name. And I'm just going to get rid of this. Okay, Command S, Command R, and you'll see I write Paco and Priscilla for me. So what that'll allow me to do, if I get that code back up, where'd it go? You're somewhere around here. Where are you? Okay. So I can run that same function, but give it different parameters, and then it could do it again. So I could do something where, for instance, down here, I want to find area, right? So I could have a function that finds area, and then what I could do is give it different numbers, and it will always do the same math for me. Okay, so basically a function is just a block of code that you can call whenever you want. All right, so typically for a function, you're going to have function. It's always going to have that. That's the keyword that says it's a function, just like you have var to say it's a variable. It's going to have parentheses. These are the parameters. So basically what you could do is you could say, okay, if you send me something, it's going to store it into these two variables. Okay, so in this case, I just made width and height. It could be whatever I want. In this case, to make it look like area, I just wrote width and height. But you make up a parameter. So in the example I used earlier, right, I made up a parameter just called name. Okay, so if it's most of the time, honestly, you're probably gonna have nothing. It'll just be empty, which means it just runs. But if it accepts something, if you're going to send it something, you need to have some sort of variable name here. And you can have multiple ones like I did earlier. Okay, so that's the parameters. Then it's going to have the open and close mustaches, this guy here and this guy here, that's the bracket. Basically that, when this function gets called, whatever's inside of these is what's going to be run. Now sometimes you'll have a return, and what that means is that if it sends something back, like if it's going to run the function and then you get something from it, it's going to return something. So just like you can send something to it, if it's sending something back, you return. Now you'll notice in the example I did earlier, I didn't return anything because I did it right here. I just have it right here. But if I wanted to return a value, I could put return. Well, it's actually doing the thing. I could just return the dog name and then it would return it to me. But you can kind of see example here. So we have a function, find area, it's accepting width and height, and then what it's going to do is it's going to make a new variable called area, and we're going to assign it the value of the width and height that we get sent, right? And it's going to make that there. Then what's going to do is it's going to send me back the value of area, okay? And all area is these two things multiplied, okay? Then what I do is I do a variable shape area, okay? So I made a new variable and I made it, I assigned it the value of calling that function find area, and I sent that function find area these two. So this 5 goes here and the 7 will go here. They'll go through, so it'll do variable area is equal to 5 times 7. Then it'll return area, which is right now 35. So basically this will become the value of what this is here, which will be 35. Then I just wrote the document.write and I wrote the result here. Okay, and that's how that works. So objects are data models that contain variables, functions, and events. The best thing to think about them is just like literally what they are, is objects. Okay, so it can have properties, which are basically just values that are thrown in it. So in this case I'm using so this is an object right here, a literal notation, which basically means I just handwrite it out. So var cars, okay, so that's the object I'm making. And then inside of that object, Okay, it's going to have a whole list of things, not just like one value. So in this case, the cars, it has a property called cars total. It's basically a variable inside of it, that car total, and that's 12. Cars in use is 6. Notice there's a comma between each one. And then cars available is going to be a function, which is going to be a method. That's a function that's inside of this object. And what that function does is it will return the cars total minus the cars in use. So basically it'll return how many cars are available. All right. Then we have events. So some objects you'll know they'll have, well, see, here's another way of doing it. So dot notation with access. So basically, if I want to get the total number of cars, or if I want to get a variable and I'm calling it total cars, I can find out what the total number of cars are by doing cars dot cars total. So basically, any one of these things that I want to know, it would be the variable name and then dot. So if I want to find out the total number of cars, it'd be cars dot total. Okay. Available cars, in this case, would be cars dot cars available, these, because that's this function here. Okay. All right. Yeah, it can also have events. So you're going to see later on when we do some of the stuff here. Let me see if I can. There you go. So you'll see here it has modal button dot on click. That's an event, and it's going to run this function. Okay. But basically an event is just something that can happen. So clicking, focusing on something, trying to think of other things that would be hovering. There's, something happens. A certain time happens, right? So it could be a certain amount of time overlaps. Those are just different events, okay? So typical order of operations is you have an event trigger a method in some way. So, you click, and then the method is going to run some sort of function. It's going to complete a series of instructions through a function, and then it's going to usually change some sort of properties, okay? Now, there are built-in objects, which basically means, so here in this example, I made this object called cars, right? And I gave it this property, and then this method. Okay, so property is just a variable, right? And then method is just a function, but they call it differently when it's inside of an object. So this has these things. So cars can be described by the total, right? I can say how many total there are in there, how many are in use, and it can also find how many there are. Those are like the things it can do. Well, you can make some, but there's also built-in ones, which means they're already pre-made. So there's the browser object model, which represents the information regarding the browser, history screen, blah, blah, blah. So it's like a big overarching thing. There's the document object model, which basically represents the HTML that you see in here, all the stuff that you see. And then there's global JavaScript objects, which are basically like built-in functions. So for instance, like you can look up like time. I think I have one down here. Let me see. Where are you at? Because I don't remember them. Accordion, not that one. Not read more. Where's the greeting one? Greeting. So if you look, there's right here this date, right? That's a built-in object. So like that's something that's already built into JavaScript generically in order to be able to keep time and things. So mostly we're going to do is deal with the document object model. So even earlier in the little crappy example I showed, you'll see that I did document, and then inside of document, that's just an object and has different variables and things that it can do about it, right? In this case, it has a function or a method because it's inside of an object that it can write. So I can go document, and when you grab the document, which is basically this window here, it's this here, okay? And then I want to write onto it. I did document.write, that's just a built-in thing. And then I sent it these parameters. So it's no different than when I write this function here and I sent it this parameter went here. I'm going to, inside of this document, there's an already made function, and I sent it this. And that function will take that and actually write it onto the web page for me. That's a built-in thing, part of the document object model. Okay. And that's basically how we deal with the stuff we want to interact with on the page. Okay, so all the elements, the way it's set up is that you have the document, and then everything that's underneath the document you can get to by using the document object model. You can click on this to see some more stuff with it, but just to kind of show you more of an example. So right here is a good example. So I want to make a variable. I'm going to call it account button, okay, or accordion button, ACCBTN. And then what I'm going to put in that is I did document.getElement by ID, or getElements by class name, accordion button. So it says accordion BTN. So what it's going to do is it's going to go to the document object, and there's a pre-made function that's going to look for an object, an element, by the class name, and it's going to look for anything with the name this, and it's going to store it in here for me. And if you look up here, you'll see, where's the HTML? Up here, you'll see one right here, accordion BTN, accordion BTN, accordion BTN. So what's going to do is all these ones that have this class, it's going to store it into this variable for me. So that way I can change them. And then later on, I can assign a event listener onto this button that listens for click, and then it runs this function. Okay, I know it's confusing. All right, so an event, so basically allows your user to interact with it. So select an element to be interacted with, indicate event type that triggers a response, and code that runs once triggered. Okay, so for instance, let's say, let's say we want to do this thing, we want to click. So I would do is do a p element, and then right attached to it, I do on click. I add this attribute, and then it's going to run, basically, in this case, it's going to run this function. So when you click, it's going to say this, which means this object that you clicked on, in this case the p, in this case the word, the time, and it's going to, on that, it's going to write the inner HTML time, or the date. So when I click on it, there you go, there's, see, works. So that's the oldest way, but you shouldn't use that, but you might see it. All right, and then so here's another one. So basically what you do is you do a p element, you give it an ID. So this time I'm just going to call it time text. So that I have a way of grabbing it with the script, and it just says click me for the date, right? So basically I just make a regular p element, and I need to have some sort of ID or class so that I can select it. Then I write my script, and I could write this way later, doesn't really matter. In the script I'm going to do the document get element by ID. So I'm going to look for an element that has time text attached to it, which happens to be this p element. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say on click. So when you click on it, all right, it's going to show date. So show date is actually a function. It's going to run the show date, and then this function is going to run when you click on it. And in this case, this function does this, which literally just writes the time for you. Okay. Now this is the newest way of doing it. It's just you might see these different ways, so I'm just kind of showing you. This is the newest way of attaching it. Basically, what you do is kind of the same thing. You do an ID so that you have a way of selecting it. Then what we're going to do is you make a function that you're going to want to run once, but this isn't going to run because there's nothing telling it to run. Then what you're going to do is you make a variable for your element message. In this case, it's going to get the element ID. So basically, I'm going to store this into here. So document get element by ID date. So it's going to look for this guy. Then what I'm going to do is I add an event listener. Okay, an event listener just means it's like attaching a function to it that's going to listen for click. And if it does click, it's going to go ahead and do disp date, which is this function. It's going to run this if you click on it. It's kind of a weird way of writing it, but that's how it works. And then if you click on it, ooh, it works. Yay. Now another thing, this is the last part of this section, is jQuery. jQuery you might see occasionally. Basically, it's pre-made. It's kind of like Bootstrap for HTML. It's just a pre-made library of JavaScript stuff that instead of it being, you can see how this is kind of cumbersome to write all this, it sort of abbreviates it and it automatically does something. So it makes it a little bit easier to work with. And that's kind of the idea behind it. We're not going to use it right now. We might use it next week. But in case you see it, you might see stuff that's like JavaScript, but it has this money symbol in it. That's how you can kind of tell that it's jQuery. Most of the jQuery stuff actually uses the money symbol, and that's sort of how it separates itself. All right, so we're going to call that good. I know that was really long, 40 minutes. And I know it's probably confusing. The best way, honestly, to understand it is I'm going to go through all these here. And then if you watch them, you'll start to get an idea of what it's thinking. All right, that's really the best way. The best way is just to practically do it, because I could sit here and be like, this goes this and then that. All I'm looking for is for you to be able to sort of read it, not necessarily be able to write it. Because once you know how to read it, you can find stuff and then just adapt it to what you need. Okay, so we're going to call that good, and then I'll do this next section.